We've been clear that we want Britain to move from a low-wage, high-tax, high-welfare economy to a higher-wage, lower-tax, lower-welfare society. The benefit system should not support lifestyles and rents that are not available to the taxpayers who pay for that system.
What they're doing is taking it off the wrong people.
And the worst thing is that the poorer you are, the more you are going to lose.
It's definitely not a living wage. How he's got the front to call it that is offensive.
Slowly, as the data is compiled by the boffins at the Office of National Statistics, what we already know is becoming alarmingly clear, namely that Britain's finances are in a shocking state. Borrowing's at its highest since records began, a touch below £800 billion, the equivalent of 57% of all of Britain's annual output. Not only is the amount the Chancellor's borrowing huge, but the amount he's pulling in from the taxpayer is actually shrinking, and fast. Following Alistair Darling's cut in VAT, the tax take has fallen at its sharpest rate since the 1920s, down by £32 billion. And of course, Darling's borrowing more because he's spending more. The amount the government forked out for social benefits rose by nearly 10% in June to more than £13 billion. And it doesn't take a genius to realise that if you're borrowing more money and spending more money and earning less, your bank balance is not going to look good. And things are only going to get worse as well. The cost of part nationalising Lloyds Banking Group and Royal Bank of Scotland has still not been factored into these figures. So how can the government get out of this miserable situation? Well, only by spending less and earning more. And that means a cut in government spending.
Take thousands of millions out of the economy now. Take 6 billion out of the economy now and think of the risk to jobs and businesses. And I say to the Conservatives, of course we want efficiency savings and of course we want to deal with waste, but we cannot afford to see private investment so small and then public investment cut at this time. We've got a responsibility for the overall growth rate of the economy. We've got to get this economy moving forward. You can't do it with private investment alone. The government has got to play its role.
Our plan is right. Our plan will work. I know that you can't see it or feel it right now, but think of it like this. The new economy we're building, it is like building a house. The most important part is the part you can't see, the foundations. Slowly but surely, we are laying the solid foundations for a stronger future.
We're facing more austerity, Prime Minister.
Time and time again in coalition, I had to veto further cuts. I vetoed billions and billions and billions of pounds of welfare cuts, which the Conservatives then immediately imposed in the first budget after we were booted out of Whitehall. So, I'm afraid the proof is in the eating of the pudding, is that we constantly restrained them. When they then had their chance to govern on their own, boy, did they default to type, and some.
The responsible thing to do is to get a grip on the debt, but in a way that brings the country together, not drives it apart. That means showing leadership at the top, which is why we will cut ministers' pay and freeze it for a parliament. It means showing that we are all in this together, which is why we will freeze public sector pay for all but the 1 million lowest paid public sector workers for 1 year to help protect jobs. And yes, it means showing that the rich will pay their share, which is why, for now, the 50p tax rate must stay and child trust funds for those on middle and higher incomes will have to go. Yes, this week we have made some tough choices, but in British politics today, it is the only responsible thing to do.
Now, it is the fundamental debate in this country and across Europe. Is austerity bringing massive government borrowing under control? Or is it simply pushing us further into recession? Here, bad industrial production figures suggest the British economy is now very close to triple-dip recession. Despite this, the government insists cuts are the only option.
Across Europe, there's been a continent-wide experiment in austerity taking place for the past 3 years. The True Believers says it's cut ballooning government deficits and kept borrowing rates low. Critics like Paul Krugman say it's just made a bad situation worse by choking off fragile post-crisis demand. Here in the UK, today's awful industrial production figures play to the fears of those austerity critics. A shock fall in industrial output in January by 1.2%, part of that down to North Sea oil platforms shutting for maintenance. But manufacturing is flat too. It means production is now at its lowest level since May 1992, more than 20 years ago. An official return to recession, the so-called triple dip, is now very much on the cards. The bigger picture since Britain's austerity experiment began is one of stagnation. Here's how the official government forecasts for British recovery back in June 2010 when the coalition took power. There's the recession, and here's the strong recovery predicted under the coalition's original tough medicine. But here's what actually happened. Output more or less flat for nearly 3 years. The difference, about 4% of national economic output. That's how much smaller the economy has turned out to be. A recovery has never been so sluggish in Britain, and this hasn't happened in the US, Germany, and all other major economies. The timing of the flattening is also uncanny. Mid-2010, the question, how much of a role did the coalition package of spending cuts and tax rises play in this line? Last week, David Cameron claimed none, but his own budget watchdog wrote to him to disagree. Of course, a far bigger experiment in austerity has been taking place in the Eurozone, in Greece, under a programme of huge upfront cuts designed by the EU IMF-led Troika. Again, the results have gone way off course. Back in 2010, the Greek economy was expected to shrink by a mere 5% over 3 years as the cuts programme demanded by the European Union was implemented. So far, it's actually fallen by 17% and will carry on shrinking this year. Spain's testing of the austerity approach is also worsening enormous social problems. Unemployment's now over 6 million. 56% of young people now out of work, and similar pictures emerge in Greece and to some degree Ireland. The argument is erupting around Europe, and in the US, Paul Krugman says the advocates of more austerity in Europe are, quote, petulant and delusional and are pursuing cockroach policies, meaning ideas that were flushed away in the past, but they keep on coming back. But the Troika says it stabilised the patients, delivered much lower government borrowing costs. Today, leading EU Commissioner Olli Rehn hit back against Krugman, telling him he was saying modified truths. Right now might be the last opportunity to take stock. Britain's set for more disappointing budget numbers next week and has lost that AAA rating for the first time. Some European leaders are pushing to water down the austerity drive at a summit on Thursday.
Official has accused the British government of inflicting misery on the country's poorest people through austerity policies.
Poverty is really a major challenge in the United Kingdom. What I found in my discussions with ministers is basically a state of denial, and they are happy with the way in which their policies are playing out. And I think that sort of punitive approach to benefits is utterly inconsistent. In fact, Brexit is going to make that worse because those in the lower income levels are really going to suffer.
1 in 5 Brits live in poverty and over 1 million people cannot afford basic essentials. The report by the UN's rapporteur on poverty and human rights adds that child poverty could actually hit 40% within a few years' time. But the UK government does say it is across the problem.
We're absolutely committed to helping people improve their lives while providing the right support for those who need it.
The author of the book, Food Bank Britain, Ray Wolford, has concerns about the statistics released in the UN report.
Why in 2018 people are literally starving to death, not just in India, not just in Yemen, not just in Kashmir, but also here in London, one of the richest capitals on the planet. Why isn't it this story is not number one on the BBC, number one on ITV? Poverty, 1 in 5, that's 20% of the population are in poverty.
I actually talk to business people for real about why they're not investing. They say, well, why should we invest? We have factories that are not operating at full capacity. There isn't demand for our products. There's no reason to invest now. What they need is more, not less from the government.
But how can that be in the face of, like you're saying, more from the government, more stimulus spending? But there has been now more than 1.5 years of incredibly cheap money from the Fed. Why isn't that enough?
Well, because if you're you're a business, you're thinking about installing new equipment in your factory. You know, the interest rate is not a big factor there. The main question is, am I going to use this stuff? So if we have a situation where the economy has been crippled by a financial crisis, which we haven't fully recovered from, where consumers are cautious because they just saw the value of their houses plunge, business is not going to invest until they see real reason to believe that we have a solid recovery. So what we're doing now is we're saying, well, no, we're going to wait for the business to invest. We're going to wait for them to take confidence in the austerity of the federal government. It's not going to happen.
Well, with me in the studio now is the Conservative Business Minister, Matthew Hancock. From Princeton, we're joined by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman. The updated paperback version of his book, End This Depression Now, has just been published here. And from Strasbourg, we're joined by the former Belgian Prime Minister and now leader of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe, Guy Verhofstadt. Paul Krugman, we'll come to the British debate specifically in a moment, but let's concentrate on the European one first. Where do you believe Europe is heading if it carries on with its austerity policies and under the leadership of the man you've been baiting in your columns, Olli Rehn?
Well, I think it's very frightening. I mean, what's happened now is Mario Draghi, by stepping into the capital markets, has headed off what might have been a very drastic financial collapse. But the real economies are still deteriorating. Unemployment is still rising. There's incredible social, cultural, political strain in a lot of Europe, and at some point it's going to crack. I mean, the Italian elections were a real warning that you cannot go down this course. This attempt to sort of suffer your way out of the European crisis is threatening a catastrophic breakup of all that the Europeans have worked on for a couple of generations now. So it's a terrible, terrible scene.
Guy Verhofstadt, you, I suppose, like the European Commissioner, Olli Rehn, are what Paul Krugman would call the face of denialism.
Well, I think what's absolutely necessary is that we continue with fiscal discipline. Otherwise, if you don't continue with fiscal discipline, you cannot guarantee your growth on the midterm and the long term. But I agree with Paul Krugman that at the same time you need also a policy of growth, of investment, of I should say of solidarity, and that is what we don't have for the moment inside the Union. And what needs to be done is very clear. The problem for countries like Italy and Spain for the moment is that they are paying a far too high interest rate on their debt. So in my opinion, a mutualization of debt can lower the interest rates for countries like Spain and Italy, and can be the balloon of oxygen that they need for their growth and their investment.
Paul Krugman, does that make sense?
Well, it helps. I would like the European Central Bank to be doing even more. The mutualization of debt, look, it's not going to happen. I would love to see it, but it's not going to happen. What you really need is you need some relaxation of the austerity. Nobody is saying that you're going to go back to free spending in Greece. You know, no one is saying that you can completely ignore the budget issues, but at this point, does an extra 3 points of GDP of contraction do anything positive? Does it actually accelerate the pace at which the competitiveness of Spanish industry improves? Does it do anything except push the social stresses to the breaking point? At the same time, you have to have a very strong reflationary policy. The ECB should be doing much more expansionary policy. Germany should not be engaging in austerity at the same time that the Southern Europeans are. That's turning this into a race to the bottom. So it's what's happened is that Europe has tried to solve this entirely through suffering, through contraction, and they don't have that much time left. I mean, nobody knows how far it can go. But again, as I said, those elections in Italy, the rise of radical political movements all through Southern Europe, that's a real that should be a warning sign. And I'm amazed at the complete unwillingness of the European Commission to admit that this is not working.
Maybe I can give one figure so to show that the mutualization of debt is clearly the solution. To combine fiscal discipline with a policy of more growth and more investment. Take, for example, Italy. Italy has a debt for the moment, as you know, of 2 trillion. If you can lower their interest rates, for example, with 1%, then they are gaining 20 billion euros. With this 20 billion euros, you can launch a policy of investment and of growth. And that's clearly what we need now. What we need now is more liquidity in the bond markets by a mutualization of debt, lowering interest rates for all countries in Europe and mainly for the countries in the south of Europe. And the difference can be the game changer in the sense of real investment and real growth in these different economies in the south of Europe.
Okay, Mr. Verhofstadt, thank you very much for now. Let's get to the British debate and bring in the Government Minister, Matthew Hancock. You wrote an article in September 2010 saying stick to Plan A and the growth will follow. When's it going to follow?
Well, that article was written, the headline is always written by the headline writers, isn't it, rather than you. But my argument there was that we have to deal with our debts in a way that is as supportive of growth as possible. And it's clear that you have to deal with your debts. You know, the argument that was just being made about the impact in Europe was also an argument for monetary activism, for low interest rates, which thankfully we've got here. And what I was interested in the slides that you put up, because you put up the slides on GDP growth, and you mentioned in the industrial production figures that part of that's due to North Sea oil coming down. But you didn't show for Britain the fact that unemployment is now lower than in the States, lower than in Europe, and that we have a record number of jobs. And that actually, if you look at, we've had a sharp decline in North Sea oil production in the financial sector, and that, if you take that off GDP, it has a very different picture. So my argument is that you need to deal with your debts as an economy. It's vital, and at the same time have monetary support. There've been things that have, made things more difficult, but the deficit's a quarter down, and we're on the way.
Paul Krugman, you've been writing about Osbornia, and you've been scathing about David Cameron and George Osborne. I mean, can you explain to...
Use that as a hypothetical name for a country that somehow looks a fair bit like the UK. So look, first of all, those employment numbers, I'm not in the UK, and even I know that there's some very funny stuff. There's a lot of self-employed. There's a lot of very low productivity jobs. Those are not a sign of economic health. And the fact of the matter is, the UK economy, there were predictions made. As your report pointed out, people, when the austerity policies were launched, there were people in the UK government saying this will not be contractionary, everything will be fine. There were people like myself, like Martin Wolf, saying, actually, no, it won't. And guess what? It hasn't been okay. It's actually been as contractionary as the warning said.
But can you just explain?
Interest rates are low. This is a good thing, but the interest rates are low across every country that borrows in its own currency. That's not really an issue. And the point is that trying to be, of course, countries have to pay their debts, but a time when the economy is still very depressed, a time when there's massive excess capacity, when there just isn't enough private demand to keep the economy afloat, is not a good time to be trying to pay down your debts. It's a time when, in fact, the effort to pay down your debts is very likely actually self-defeating, even in purely fiscal terms, because you're contracting the economy, you're reducing revenue, and you're damaging the long run as well. Sustained weak economic performance is not good for long-run economic growth either. So
Matthew Hancock, do you
I've
accept...
been describing it, and I will continue to describe it. What's happening in the UK...
Let me just bring in Matthew Hancock, Paul Krugman. Matthew, do you actually accept that austerity depresses growth, as the Office of Budgetary Responsibility made clear?
Yeah, I accept that austerity has a short-term impact on growth, which is what the
So it is
OBR
self-defeating
said.
in the short term.
No, it's not. There's a difference between having an impact and having an impact that stops you dealing with your debts. We have been dealing with our debts.